I just want the listeners, if you're listening to this on audio, to know that I have a giant smile going from one end of my face to the other because I love this answer so much. Thank you so much for that, Chris.
My pleasure.
My next question to you is, if you could invite four guests for a dream dinner, who would they be and why?
So this is a fascinating one, and I've answered the question to a certain extent in my book, The Alliance. I'm going to cite that just so people want to say, "Hey, you're stealing from yourself." So in my book, The Alliance, along with my friends Ben Kasnoka and Reid Hoffman, we write about one of the ways to figure out what your key priorities, aspirations, and values are, is to ask yourself who are the people you really admire, heroes that you can model yourself on. And that conveniently enough gives me three people that I would automatically invite, and I just have to pick a fourth. So the three figures, and they could be any figures from historical figures to fictional figures. And the three figures I cited are, first of all, Abraham Lincoln, 16th president of the United States of America. Many people consider him America's greatest president. He led the country through its most difficult time, was also perhaps the greatest writer and orator of any of our presidents. And that's saying something because we had some pretty good ones along the way. And somebody who rose, really the quintessential American story, rose from nothing, from a poor background, no education, to become the president of the United States and the most revered person in this country. And it was due to several things. Obviously, his innate talent. He was immensely gifted, incredibly intelligent. Physically, he was basically an action hero, right? He was stronger and taller and faster. It almost seems like he's not human. And in fact, there is a comic book series called Invincible, which Amazon made into a television animated series, where there is somebody named the Immortal. And it turns out the immortal was Abraham Lincoln and many other figures throughout history. Somehow he's just lived forever, and he pops up in throughout history as someone when he's needed, who is literally a superhero. But anyways, Abraham Lincoln. So obviously, I would love to be a superhero. I'm not. I like to think I'm fairly intelligent. But the key to Abraham Lincoln's success was not just his intelligence, but that orientation towards others. Like there's a famous story. Edwin Stanton became Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War. And Stanton was a rival of Lincoln's and had also, even more incredibly, treated him very shabbily earlier in their careers. So Lincoln was a lawyer, and Stanton was a very famous lawyer, much more famous than Lincoln. And his firm had hired Lincoln to be a part of a case. And basically, it was just because they needed to have someone local. They didn't want him to do anything. They just needed him to be there. And he happened to be a member of that particular bar or that particular location. And they didn't want him to do any work. But Lincoln, being Lincoln, had carefully researched the case and come up with all these things and provided this whole brief. And here's all the information you need to know. And Stanton basically said, listen, we didn't hire you for your brain. We hired you because of where you are. And he threw it in the garbage. And so Stanton really treated him quite shabbily. And then, of course, later on, they were both running for president, and Lincoln ultimately won. But he saw the incredible capability of Stanton. He was willing to overlook the slights and the various criticisms that Stanton had leveled against him and all these different things because he was focused on what's going to be best for the United States of America, what's best for the country. I need the very best people. And so he made Edwin Stanton his Secretary of War, and the two of them worked together side by side, endless hours in the telegraph rooms following the progress of the war. Of course, they ultimately won that war. And when Lincoln was assassinated very tragically after the end of the war, Stanton was heartbroken. And he is the one who said when Lincoln was dying, he said, now he belongs to the ages. And he became the most admired, most beloved figure in Stanton's life. Now, that is a sign of the character of Abraham Lincoln, and one of the reasons why it would be so incredible to get a chance to talk to someone who's so intelligent, so wise, so remarkable in so many ways. The second person I would mention, and I do want to choose someone from the world of business because too often the world of business gets short shrift when it comes to these things, is a figure who I think really created the original soul of Silicon Valley, and that's David Packard of Hewlett Packard. Hewlett Packard, of course, one of the great corporations of the 20th century, still around, still very valuable, but not quite as prominent as it once was, as it was under Bill and Dave, as they were known, pioneered all the good things of Silicon Valley, pioneered broad ownership of stock options and bonuses and profit sharing, pioneered a more humane management style. They came up with management by walking around. And there are a lot of famous Bill and Dave stories of how they helped other people and how they were always looking to really help their employees. There's a famous example of how over one weekend, Bill Hewlett came into the office. He discovered that one of the supply cabinets had been locked. And he was irate, and he found a pair of bolt cutters, and he cut the lock off the cabinet because he was looking to get some components to do some tinkering. And then he put a note there saying, never lock our supply cabinets. We trust our people. And if they need something, they have a good reason for it. And that's the kind of person that Bill and Dave were. Dave was actually the CEO and sort of the leader. Bill was also the spiritual leader. I had to pick one. I couldn't pick them both at once, although I suppose I could cheat and say just invite both of them to the dinner. But I won't do that. And this ethos in Silicon Valley of collaboration, working together, treating people the right way, trusting, this was known as the HP way. And it's a way that, tragically has been a little overlooked now because of a figure that they actually helped. So here's another fascinating intersection. And you know what? I might as well pick this guy as number 4 because I can only imagine. I've only had a chance to be in a room with him once, and I would love to do it again. And that is Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs, I think, is very clearly the greatest businessman of all time and has revolutionized more industries than anyone else. And people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos look up to him and envy him for what he's accomplished, right? This guy is clearly the greatest of all time, the Michael Jordan of the business world. And there's actually an interesting intersection between him and Hewlett Packard. When he was a young guy, just starting out, he and Steve Wozniak were trying to figure out, hey, we want to build something, and Woz actually worked for HP at the time. Steve Jobs somehow found Bill Hewlett's telephone number and called him up. And Bill Hewlett talked to this young kid. No reason to do this. He's already one of the most famous, wealthiest men in the world. And he talks with this young kid that nobody knows and ends up like giving Steve Jobs a bunch of hardware and stuff to allow him to pursue his entrepreneurial endeavors. And I just feel saddened that Steve didn't learn more from Bill and Dave about how to treat people, because Steve, there were many good things about Steve, but he did not treat people well in many cases, whether it's his family members, his executives, his business partners, what have you. People often took the wrong lesson away. They say, you have to be ruthless like Steve Jobs. I'm like, no, you don't get it. Steve Jobs was an overwhelming genius. And the reason he got away with being a dick to people was because he was such a genius that people would overlook those things. The lesson is not to be a dick. The lesson is to be the greatest genius the world has ever seen. And then when you have that, you can do a lot of things. And yet, of course, many of these great geniuses, like I said, Abraham Lincoln, despite being superior to us in every conceivable way, still had humility and grace and all these things that, alas, Steve Jobs did not. But he's still such a fascinating figure that I would absolutely invite him to dinner. He might dominate the discussion, but I'd like to believe that, Abraham Lincoln and David Packard could help rein him in. And then I'll bring in the final figure, perhaps the polar opposite of Steve Jobs in almost every way, except for being, again, a great genius. And that is Fred Rogers, known as Mr. Rogers here in the United States, beloved children's performer and entertainer, but really educator. And with Fred Rogers, if you just have to read the stories, this guy was the closest thing you can imagine to a living saint in terms of his approach to the world. And he wanted everyone to feel loved. He wanted everyone to feel accepted. And it didn't mean that you shouldn't try to change, but it did mean that people should know who you are and say, hey, I'm proud of you. I love you. And the kinds of things that he did in his life. I mean, you can go onto YouTube. There's this amazing video of what happened when in the 1970s, I believe it was, they were looking to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, public television here in the United States. And Mr. Rogers went out and gave this speech to Congress, and they were looking to defund. And Mr. Rogers gives this speech, and he talks about the importance of the work and how it's reaching children. And at the end of it, the chairman of the committee just says, the guy who was trying to defund it's like, well, I think we're going to give you your money. And in fact, not only did they not defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, they increased its budget, because after Mr. Rogers spoke, they're like, oh my God, we need more of this. There's another thing. He was honored. I don't remember whether it was by the Academy or by the Emmys, sort of the entertainment world. And he was receiving an honorary award. And he goes up to speak. And again, you can find this on YouTube. It's incredible. And he speaks and he says, I want you to think about, some of the people who've been really important to your life, some of the people who loved you and supported you. And I want you to just take a moment to think of them and think of the gratitude you feel and think of the love that you feel for them. And the entire room goes silent. And eventually you can start to hear people crying, right? This is like the most cynical group of people in the world. And he has reduced them to sobbing children because of the great purity of his vision and the way that he really got to fundamental human emotions. So those would be the four. Like I said, 3 from the Alliance. That's Abraham Lincoln, David Packard, and Fred Rogers. And we'll tack on Steve Jobs as the 4th. And I think that would be fascinating, a set of contrasts, right? People from very different worlds.